The man who almost got my parents deported had a nice office, a whole wall of framed certificates that meant absolutely nothing, and no idea at all that the daughter he'd never bothered to worry about reads and files legal documents for a living. That last part matters. Hold on to it. Because this is a story about a man who spent years betting that the people he robbed would be too frightened, too ashamed, and too unfamiliar with how any of it worked to ever come after him. And for a long time, that bet paid off beautifully. He picked families who flinched at the word government. He picked people who had learned, the hard way, in another country and in this one, that the safest thing to do when something goes wrong is to keep your head down and say nothing. He built his whole business on their silence. And then he took money from the wrong family, because he did not know that one of the daughters had grown up to do the one job that turns silence into paperwork. My name is Anna. I was 28 when this happened, and I have been, in one way or another, my parents' translator since I was 7 years old. If you grew up the way I grew up, the firstborn child of parents who came here with more courage than English, you know exactly what I mean. And if you didn't, let me try to explain it. Because you cannot understand what I did later without understanding the child I was first. I was the one who called the electric company when the bill was wrong. I was the one who sat in the beige chairs at the doctor's office and translated words a 7-year-old should not have to know. And then the ones at the school and the bank and the county office with the long lines and the number you take from a little red machine. I stood at the counter at the DMV on a step stool of my own nerve and spoke for my father, who could rebuild a tractor engine blindfolded, but could not make the woman behind the glass understand him. I was, before I was 10 years old, the bridge my family walked across to reach the English-speaking world. And that is a strange and heavy thing to be when you are still losing baby teeth. It made me anxious. It also made me very, very good at reading a form and knowing exactly what it was really asking. My parents are named Rafael and Elena. They came to the Central Valley of California before I was born, to the flat, hot farm country, where everything green in an American grocery store starts its life. And they worked. God, they worked. My father worked the fields, and then the packing houses, and then, for the last 15 years, ran a small landscaping operation, with 2 trucks and a loyalty from his customers that money cannot buy. My mother cleaned houses and raised 3 kids and could stretch a chicken across 4 dinners. They built a whole life in a country that never once made it easy for them. And the one thing that always sat over that life like a cloud, the thing we did not talk about at dinner, was papers, status. The long, expensive, terrifying process of trying to become, on paper, what they already were in every way that mattered, which was people who belonged here. For years they have been trying to fix it the right way, and the right way in this country is a maze designed by people who will never have to walk it. It is slow, and it costs money most families do not have. And one wrong move can undo a decade of careful living. So when a man opened a bright new office in a strip mall near our neighborhood, with a big sign that said Immigration Services, and a smile that put people at ease, and when word went around the community that he could help, that he knew the system, that he had gotten papers for the Hernandez family and old Mr. Trujillo, my parents did what frightened, hopeful people do. They trusted him. They did not tell me because they knew I would have questions, and because there is a particular pride in immigrant parents that does not want the child they sacrificed for to have to carry their problems. They wanted to hand me a solved thing. So they went to him alone, His name was Delgado, and I want to be careful about him, because the easy version of this story makes him a cartoon, and the true version is worse. He was not a stupid man. He was charming and organized, and he understood his customers precisely because he came from the same world they did, which is the part that still makes me sick. He called himself a notario, and if you did not grow up in our community, you might not understand the power in that word. So let me tell you. In many of the countries our families come from, a notario is not what a notary is here. Back home, a notario is a highly trained lawyer, a person of real legal authority, someone you trust with the most important documents of your life. Here, a notary public is a person with a stamp who watches you sign things. Delgado lived in the space between those two meanings, and he got rich there. He let my parents believe he was, in effect, a lawyer. He was not a lawyer. He was not anything. He had no license to practice law, no authority to give legal advice, no standing to file the things he charged people to file. In California, it is actually against the law for an immigration consultant to do most of what he was doing: to give legal advice, to call himself a notario, to promise the outcomes he promised. But my parents did not know that, because how would they? And that not knowing was the entire product he was selling. He charged them thousands of dollars in cash, in installments, the savings they had scraped together for exactly this purpose, the money that was supposed to buy the end of the cloud. He took it in an envelope across a desk, and he gave them a receipt with a logo on it, and he told them not to worry, that he was handling everything, that these things take time, and that they should not talk to anyone else about their case, because it could complicate the filing. Keep it quiet. Trust me. Don't involve anyone. You have heard those words before in this story, because they are always the words. And then he did nothing. That is the part I still cannot fully forgive, the sheer laziness of the cruelty. He did not file the paperwork he was paid to file. Or he filed something, once, wrong, incomplete. A form that did more harm than good. I was never entirely sure which because the man kept no honest records. He took the money and he let the clock run. And immigration cases are all about the clock. Deadlines that do not forgive. Windows that close and do not reopen. My parents called him when they got nervous, and he reassured them. They called again, and he was harder to reach. Months passed. A year. And the whole time they thought they were inside a process, being handled, moving toward the light. When in truth, they were just standing still in a field while a storm they couldn't see gathered on the horizon. The storm arrived in an envelope with a government seal, and it arrived at my parents' house on an ordinary Tuesday, and it was a notice to appear. If you know what that is, your stomach just dropped. And if you don't, it is the piece of paper that begins the process of removing you from the country. Deportation. After 30 years. My father, who had paid taxes and coached a Little League team and never once had so much as a parking ticket, was being told to appear and explain why he should not be expelled from the only home his children had ever known. And the reason he was in that position, the direct and provable reason, was that a man in a strip mall had taken his money and his trust and filed nothing, or filed poison, and let him walk blind into the exact danger he'd paid to be saved from. That was the night my mother finally called me. I will never forget her voice on the phone. My strong mother, who had crossed a desert and cleaned 1,000 strangers' toilets and never once let me see her afraid. And she was afraid now. She was trying not to cry and failing, and she kept saying she was sorry. Sorry, mija. We didn't want to worry you. We thought he was helping. And I drove the 2 hours home that night, with my hands very calm on the wheel, and something happening inside me that I had never felt before. A kind of cold I did not know I had in me. Because here is the thing Delgado did not know. The thing none of them ever know until it is too late. He had spent his career preying on families precisely because they didn't know how the system worked. And he had just handed a notice to appear to a woman whose daughter spends every single working day inside exactly that system. Reading it, filing in it, speaking its language fluently and without fear. I am a paralegal. I need to be precise about what that means, because it matters to everything that came after. I am not a lawyer. I cannot give legal advice. I cannot represent anyone, and I did not, at any point, pretend otherwise. Because the whole disease I was fighting was people pretending to be lawyers who weren't. But I work for lawyers. I have for 6 years. I know how a case is built, how a document is filed, how a deadline is calculated, how a complaint is drafted, and where it is sent, and what makes an agency actually move instead of filing your letter in a drawer. I know the difference between a licensed attorney and a man with a stamp, because knowing that difference is my literal job. Delgado had robbed the one family in the neighborhood with a daughter who could not be intimidated by a wall of meaningless certificates, because she'd learned in the 6th grade to read what a document actually says instead of what a smiling man tells you it says. I sat at my parents' kitchen table that night, the same table where I'd done my homework, where I translated bills and letters my whole childhood, and I made 2 lists on a legal pad. The first list was the emergency, and the emergency was my parents. And I want to be very clear about the first thing I did, because it is the thing too many people get wrong, and it is the thing that separates what I did from what Delgado did. I did not try to fix the immigration case myself. I am not qualified to, and a person's whole life is not a place for an amateur, even a well-meaning one. The first thing I did, first thing the very next morning, was find my parents a real lawyer. A licensed, actual, verified immigration attorney. The exact thing Delgado had only pretended to be. I knew how to find one, which most people don't, and that knowledge is a kind of privilege I did not earn, and have spent the years since trying to give away. You can look up any lawyer on the State Bar's website and see, in black and white, whether they are actually licensed, whether they are in good standing, whether anyone has ever disciplined them. It takes 90 seconds. If my parents had known to type Delgado's name into that search 4 years ago, they would have found nothing, because he was never there to find, and this whole story would not exist. I found them a real one. Her name was Grace Okoro, an immigration attorney with a small, hard-working practice and a reputation for taking the cases other lawyers called hopeless. And I called her office at 8 in the morning, and I did not stop being politely, precisely persistent until she agreed to see my parents that week. I went with them, of course. I sat in the chair I had sat in my whole life, the translator chair, the bridge chair, except this time I did not have to translate the law because I understood it. And that was its own strange grief, realizing how much easier my childhood might have been if the adults around me had ever once been given a fair map. Grace was everything Delgado was not. She did not promise anything. That was the first thing I noticed, and a thing that told me she was real. Because the real ones never promise. The real ones tell you the truth. And the truth has edges. She looked at what little documentation my parents had, the logoed receipts, the notice to appear, and her face got very still and very focused. And she asked hard questions, and she did not sugarcoat the answer. The answer was that it was bad, and that it was not hopeless, and that those two things were both true at once. The notice to appear was real, and had to be fought, and fought properly, in front of a judge, and that was frightening. But my parents had 30 years of clean, documented, tax-paying life in this country, and they had, it turned out, a strong case for relief once they finally had someone competent presenting it. And there was even a bitter irony that being victims of exactly this kind of fraud was a fact that a good attorney could put to use rather than hide. What had nearly destroyed them, handled right, became part of the argument for mercy. Grace took the case. For the first time since that envelope arrived, my mother slept through the night. Because for the first time, a person with an actual license and actual competence had said, "I will stand next to you in that courtroom, and I know what I am doing." That was the emergency handled, or at least placed in real hands. Which brought me to the second list on my legal pad, the longer one, the colder one. Because saving my own parents was necessary, and it was not enough, and I knew it wasn't enough, sitting at that kitchen table the very first night. A man like Delgado does not have one victim. A man like Delgado has a business model, and the business model is a community. And if I fixed my own family's case and walked away, he would simply keep going, envelope after envelope, family after family. And the next notice to appear would land on the next kitchen table, and the next, forever. Because everyone he robbed was too scared to be the one who spoke. I had spent my whole childhood being the one who spoke. I was not going to stop now. So I did the thing I do for a living. Except this time, it was personal. And I did it better than I have ever done anything. I started to build a file. I began with my own parents, and I built their piece of it the way I'd build any case at work. Cleanly, completely, with an almost loving precision. Every receipt photographed and logged with its date. The logoed papers he'd given them. A written timeline of every payment, every promise, every phone call, reconstructed from my parents' memory and, where I could, from their bank records and their phone records. Because cash is hard to trace, but the pattern around cash leaves fingerprints. And then the centerpiece, the thing that turns a sad story into a case. Proof of the nothing. I had Grace's office help my parents formally request their record from the Immigration Service. And when it came back, it showed, in the government's own cold print, that the thing Delgado had been paid thousands of dollars to file had, in the crucial window, never been properly filed at all. His entire service, reduced to a document that proved its own absence. That is the kind of paper that ends a man. But I already knew one family's file, however perfect, was just one sad story. And one sad story is easy for an overworked agency to set aside. What I needed was a pattern, because a pattern is a different animal entirely. A pattern is not a complaint. A pattern is a predator. So I went looking for the others, and this was the hardest part, and the part that taught me the most about the very silence Delgado had been counting on. Because they did not want to come forward. Of course they didn't. That was the whole engine of his business. When I started, carefully, through my mother, through the church, through the slow, careful web of a community that talks in kitchens but not to authorities, to ask whether anyone else had used the Notario in the strip mall, what I met first was fear. People who had lost thousands of dollars did not want to admit it, because admitting it meant admitting they'd been foolish, and it meant putting their own precarious status in a sentence next to the word government. And it meant trusting me, another person promising to help, when the last person who promised to help had ruined them. I understood every bit of it. I had grown up inside that fear. And that, in the end, was exactly why they eventually trusted me. Because I was not an outsider with a clipboard. I was Elena's daughter. I had translated at their appointments, too. I was one of them. And I was not afraid. And my not being afraid turned out to be contagious. One by one they came. It took weeks, and a lot of coffee at a lot of kitchen tables, and a lot of promising, truthfully, that I was not the police, and I was not immigration, and I was not going to put anyone in danger. That all I wanted was to write down what happened to them so that it could not happen to anyone else. And the stories, when they came, were almost word for word the same. Which is how you know you are not looking at bad luck, but at a machine. The bright office, the word Notario, the reassurance, the cash, the receipt with the logo, the nothing. A widow in her 70s named Marta had given him almost her entire savings to help her son, and gotten nothing, and been too ashamed to tell even her own family until a paralegal she trusted sat in her kitchen and held her hand and said, "This was not your fault. You were robbed by a professional, and it is going to be written down." There was an evening that I keep like a photograph, when a few of the families came to my parents' living room, nervous, sitting on the edge of the couch with their coats still on. And I watched something happen that I don't think any of them had let themselves feel before. They started to talk. And as they talked, each one describing the bright office, and the word Notario, and the envelope, and the nothing, they realized in real time, in front of each other, that they were not alone. That they had not been singled out for their own foolishness. That the exact same thing, in the exact same words, had been done to the neighbor across the room. You could watch the shame lift off them like a fog burning away. Because shame is a private thing, it needs you isolated, and the second these families saw their own story on someone else's face, it stopped being their personal failure and started being his crime. A man had done this to all of them. That is a very different feeling, and it is a feeling that makes people brave. Marta told her story to that room with her chin up, the widow who had been too ashamed to tell her own son. And when she finished, an old man across the room who had lost his own money reached over and just held her hand. Two strangers who had been robbed by the same predator. And I had to go into the kitchen for a minute so nobody would see my face. Because I understood, standing at my mother's stove, that what Delgado had truly stolen from these people was not only their savings. It was their sense that they were competent adults who could navigate the world. He had made a whole neighborhood feel stupid and small, one envelope at a time. And what was happening in my parents' living room, the talking, the hand-holding, the slow straightening of spines, was the beginning of them taking that back. I also want to be honest about what it cost me, because I don't want anyone thinking it was easy or clean. I had a full-time job. I did all of this at night and on weekends, at kitchen tables and on the phone, for months, while holding down the work that actually paid my rent. I was tired in a way that got into my bones. And there was fear, too, a real one, because gathering frightened people and pointing them at the government is a delicate, dangerous thing. And if I did it wrong, if I made a promise I couldn't keep, or exposed someone who couldn't afford to be exposed, I would be doing a version of the very harm I was trying to undo. I lay awake over that. I checked everything twice, then a third time, the way my father taught me to check a thing. I carried it. But I carried it towards something, and that makes even a heavy thing bearable. By the end, I had a dozen families, 12 households, 12 variations on one identical theft, tens of thousands of dollars taken in total, and, more damning than any single dollar, a documented pattern of a man without a license practicing law, giving legal advice, calling himself a notario, and making promises that state law flatly forbids. Because that is the thing I understood that most of his victims did not. In California, what Delgado did is not a gray area, and it is not merely unethical. It is against several specific laws at once. There are rules about who may call themselves an immigration consultant, and what they may charge, and what they are absolutely prohibited from doing. And giving legal advice and calling yourself a notario are right at the top of the forbidden list. And practicing law without a license is its own violation entirely. He had been breaking all of it, in the open, for years, protected by nothing but the silence of the people he robbed. So I took the silence, and I turned it into a document, and then I turned the document into a weapon. And I did it the boring, unglamorous, devastating way that actually works. I built a master file, the way I'd build a brief at work. A cover memorandum laying out the pattern in plain language. An index. And then the exhibits. 12 of them, one per family, each with its statement and its receipts and its timeline. Each one an echo of the last, so that anyone who opened that file would understand within 90 seconds that they were not looking at a disgruntled customer, but at a serial predator with a strip mall office. I had one of the attorneys I work for read the whole thing before it went anywhere. Not because I needed permission, but because I wanted it airtight. And she read it and was quiet for a moment and said, "Anna, this is better organized than half of what crosses my desk from actual firms." It was the proudest I have ever been of anything. Then I sent it where it would do the most damage. And this is the part where the quiet way beats the loud way every single time. I did not go stand outside his office with a sign. I did not confront him, did not give him a scene to feel wronged about, did not hand him any warning at all. I filed. I filed a complaint with the State Bar of California, which has a whole unit for exactly this, for people practicing law without a license. And a file like mine is precisely what they are hunting for. I filed a complaint with the Office of the California Attorney General, which enforces the consumer protection laws and the specific statutes about immigration consultants, and which has real power to shut a fraudulent operation down and claw money back. I sent it to the county district attorney because taking people's money by fraud is not just a civil matter, it can be a crime. And I reported it to the Federal Trade Commission on top of all of it, so the pattern would live in more than one database. 12 documented families, cross-referenced and indexed, landing on the desks of the exact agencies built to act on them. That is a very different thing from one scared phone call. And the difference is the whole point of everything I am telling you. One voice they can ignore. 12 voices, organized into a pattern by someone who knows how the machine reads, they cannot. And then, the way it always is with the procedural path, I had to wait. And waiting is the tax you pay for doing it right instead of doing it loud. But the machinery, once it turns, does not turn back. Investigators started reaching out to the families, and because I had prepared every one of them, because I had sat in their kitchens and told them what to expect and promised to be there, they did not vanish back into their fear. They answered. They handed over their receipts. The pattern held under real scrutiny because it was real. And somewhere in an office across town, a man who had spent years certain that these people would never, ever come after him, got the first phone call that told him he had been wrong about the one thing his entire business depended on. I was not there to see his face, and I want to tell you that I have made my peace with never seeing it, because wanting to see it was never what this was about. What I got instead was better. Delgado's operation was shut down. The state moved against him, and the smiling office in the strip mall with the wall of meaningless certificates closed its doors, and the sign came down. He was ordered, through the legal process, to pay restitution to the families he had defrauded. And I will be honest with you the way I promised those families I would always be honest. That not every dollar came back. Because stolen money is like spilled water, and some of it is simply gone. But real money did come back to real families who thought they'd never see a cent of it. And more than that, he faced actual criminal exposure for what he had done. And he will never again put out a shingle in that community and take an envelope across a desk from a frightened person who trusts the word Notario. The machine that he had counted on to protect him, the slow, careful machine of the law, turned out to work just fine once somebody finally fed it what it needed. But the sweetest part, the part that matters more than his closed office, is what happened to the 12 families. Because a shutdown and a fine only end the bad thing. They don't build the good thing. The good thing was that a dozen households who had been robbed and left in danger finally got connected to real, licensed help. Grace and a legal aid organization she worked with, and a couple of other honest immigration attorneys, took on the families whose cases could still be salvaged, and did for them, properly, what Delgado had only pretended to do. Some of those cases had been damaged past saving, and I won't pretend otherwise, because he had let deadlines die that could not be revived. But some were saved. Real papers got filed by real lawyers. The cloud lifted off more than one family that had lived under it for years, including mine. I have to tell you about mine. Grace fought my parents' case the way she fought everything, thoroughly and without theater. And she stood next to my father in that courtroom exactly as she'd promised. And in the end, after a stretch of months that aged all of us, the removal case against my parents was resolved and closed, and they were put back onto the honest, lawful path toward the status they had been trying to reach for 3 decades. The very thing Delgado had sold them and never delivered. A real lawyer delivered, out in the open, with a license you could look up in 90 seconds. My mother framed nothing, and thanked God quietly, and went back to her garden. My father shook Grace's hand for a long time, and could not find the words, which for my father is the loudest thing he does. Here is what happened next, and it is the part I am building the rest of my life around. I kept thinking about the 90 seconds. The 90 seconds it takes to look up whether a lawyer is really a lawyer, the 90 seconds that would have saved my parents 4 years of fear and thousands of dollars, if only anyone had ever told them that the 90 seconds existed. That is what a predator like Delgado truly steals. Not just the money, the not knowing. He built an empire in the gap between what my community needed to know and what anyone had ever bothered to teach us. And I decided I was going to spend my Saturdays closing that gap, 1 kitchen table's worth of families at a time. So I started a clinic, a free one, on Saturday mornings in the back room of a church that let us use the space, And I want to be careful to tell you what it is and is not, because the whole point is doing it right. I am not a lawyer, and I do not pretend to be one, and I do not give legal advice, because that is the exact line Delgado crossed, and I will die before I blur it. What I do is organize and translate and teach the boring, powerful, life-saving basics. How to look up a lawyer's license in 90 seconds. What a notario is and is not here versus back home. What questions to ask. What a real attorney will and will not promise. Which nonprofits offer real help for free or nearly free. And Grace and other actual licensed attorneys volunteer their Saturdays and give the real legal advice in the open for nothing to families who walk in carrying the same fear my parents carried and walk out carrying a little bit of the map instead. The first Saturday, I stood up in front of a room full of nervous families, people who had come in braced to be judged or tricked or reported, and I felt the whole shape of my life fold back on itself. Because I was 7 years old again, standing at a counter, being the bridge my family walked across to reach a world that spoke a language they didn't. Except now, I was not a frightened child translating a bill. I was a grown woman who had turned that whole anxious childhood into a skill, and the skill into a shield. And I was handing the shield to my own people so their kids would not have to grow up as scared and as parentified as I did. My parents sat in the front row that first Saturday. My mother cried. The good kind. My father, who does not cry, looked at me with an expression I had waited my whole life to earn. A few months into the clinic, a young mother came in on a Saturday, maybe 23, a baby on her hip, and she was shaking a little, the way people do when they've been carrying a worry alone too long. She told me a man had promised to fix her husband's papers, that he had an office and a nice manor, and had asked for $3,000, and that she'd come to us because something about it, she couldn't say what, had made her uneasy the night before she was supposed to hand over the money. And I sat down next to her, and I took out my phone, and I showed her the 90 seconds. The State Bar's website. The search box. His name. Nothing. No such lawyer, in good standing or otherwise, anywhere in the state. She looked at that empty search result for a long moment, and then she looked at me, and she started to cry. But it was relief. It was the sound of a trap not closing. That is the whole reason the clinic exists, right there. She had not lost her money yet. She had not gotten a notice to appear. There was no ruined case for Grace to try to salvage, no removal hearing, no year of terror. Because this time, the story got interrupted before it could start, by nothing more than a young woman trusting her own unease enough to walk into a church basement, and a paralegal showing her a 90-second search. My parents' whole nightmare, and Marta's, and all 12 families, prevented for one more household by the cheapest, simplest thing in the world, which is knowing where to look. I have thought many times that if I do nothing else worthwhile with my life, that Saturday morning was enough. That is where the story leaves them, and where it leaves me. Delgado's office is a nail salon now, I'm told. The families got what could be gotten back. My parents are still here, lawfully, in the country their children call home, growing tomatoes and chiles in a Central Valley garden, and spoiling grandchildren who will never have to stand on a stepstool of nerve at a government counter, because their mother will already know exactly what the form is asking. And every Saturday, in the back of a church, A little more of the not knowing gets given away for free, which is the only real cure for the thing that man built his career on. I learned something in all of it that I would give to you if I could, and it is this. The people who prey on the frightened are betting, every single time, on your silence and your not knowing. That is the whole bet. And the thing they are most afraid of in the world is not anger, because anger they can survive. Anger they can even use. The thing they are afraid of is a person who stays calm and writes it all down and knows exactly which door to walk it through. You do not have to be a lawyer to be that person. My parents weren't. I just happened to know where the doors were. So let me be the one who tells you, the way I wish someone had told my mother and father years ago. The doors exist, and you are allowed to use them. And there are people who will help you for free. And you can look up in 90 seconds whether the person you are trusting with your life is really who they say they are. If you made it to the end of my family story, I would genuinely love to hear from you. Because I know we are not the only ones this has happened to, not by a long way. Has someone in your life, your family, your neighborhood, ever been taken by a fake lawyer, a phony consultant, a notario, someone who bet on your silence? Did they ever come forward, or did the fear win? And if it hasn't happened to you, do me one favor and go tell someone you love about the 90 seconds, about looking up the license, because that one small thing prevents this whole story. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from and how old you are, because I picture all of you out there, and some of you, I know, are the kid who translates for their family, and I want you to know I see you, and it gets better. And what feels like a burden right now might turn out to be the thing that lets you protect the people you love. If this meant something to you, give it a like so it reaches the family that needs it. And subscribe if you'd like to sit with me for another. Look out for each other, and look up the license.